So, who are you?
That's a good question. My name is Aaron Alter, and I am a composer from Carlsbad, California, in the United States.
It's very nice to meet you on the screen today. We meet the first time, talking the first time, but we've known each other now for 7 years. So, how come?
Well, it's the wonder of the internet. In 2013, I rejoined the musical community after being away from it for many years, and I got to know people in the music world, performers, composers. I rekindled friendships with people that I've known many years ago. Didn't really have much contact with them, and I discovered a lot of musical organizations, musicians, and just became their friends on Facebook and enjoyed their performances and their experiences.
So, we have a completely virtual relationship, Aaron.
Yes.
But the reason why we talk today here is I wanted to get you to know in person, and why is that? Because you have been so supportive over the last 7 years. All these, how do you say, postings or posts of the pianists from Weltklassik, you liked them, you shared them, and you even contacted the pianist and said, "Hey, that's great what you did," and I want to thank you very much for the support you gave to us from California.
It's least I can do. It's I think you have a large variety of musical styles and venues. Some very impressive. It was almost like I was getting a tour of Europe when I saw all the impressive, monumental, sometimes venues where you give concerts. It was just a wonderful thing, and then hearing all the different representatives of different countries and the music that inspires them.
Yeah.
And it's just a different focus than sometimes what we hear in the United States.
Yeah, it's particular, peculiar. My English is worsening every day. But anyway, I wanted to get you to
Better
know
than my
because,
German.
but excuse me?
It's better than my German.
Well, um, I just wanted to get you to know because I also know that you are a composer. So you compose piano music. So you just said you had a long break from composing. And so if you would like to share with us, how did it all start? I mean, how, as a young person, how did you turn to piano music and composition?
Well, I had always played the piano, I think, from when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I started out playing by ear mostly, and I didn't really get involved. I had a piano teacher, but I was more interested in improvisation and in just playing by ear, playing things that I heard, popular songs, rock music, jazz, and not as much as in classical, but later on, I became more interested in the musical forms, and the structure, and so I gravitated more toward the classics, and I started writing, and when I was in high school, and then I got into Northwestern School of Music in Evanston, Illinois, and I expanded my experience of music, and I became first a piano major, then a composition major. And then I went to Princeton. I had some very rigorous musical training, and as well as sort of logic and philosophy, a lot of interesting things going on in Princeton in those days. But composition was always something that I gravitated towards, mainly because I craved the kind of structure, and it was kind of an escape for me from reality. So you could in a musical work have a certain structure and form and somewhat perfection, at least the trying to attain perfection that you couldn't get in real life. So music has always been kind of an escape for me. So and a lot of composers approach music that way, and they're different composers approach it differently. Some want to reflect reality, some want to have shock value, and some want to convey pain or whatever. But in my case, it was more of an escape to a world where things could be perfect and the forms are nice and classical, and we could design things. So that was my approach initially.
What is it you were escaping from?
Well, I grew up in the 1960s. It was a tumultuous time, and I just went into music as an escape from that. Okay. I wanted to have go to a different kind of a world. And you see that in a lot of composers, for instance, in Bach's music. He definitely was in a different kind of world than what he lived. And there's some composers where like Wagner, and he was in the thick of the worldly experience in his music. You could hear that. Mm-hmm. But there are some composers where they're just divorced from that. They want to go to a different kind of plane of existence when they write, and Bach was like that.
Okay.
To some extent.
It reminds me a little bit of this word disaster area. Have you come across this? Yes. We're talking about the same thing in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where there's another planet. You go to another planet, but it sounds a little bit. You can escape if you go to outside to different places, but this sounded more the way you described it as if you are escaping into the inside.
Oh yeah, and many people talk about a kind of a spiritual awakening, or way that they find their inner self. And it actually took me a while to find out, to discover what inspired me, because at least when I was in the university, I followed the curriculum, and I did very well, and I discovered a little bit about what I wanted to do in music, but I didn't really get inspired until I left music for a while and came back. And sort of, if you look at what a sonata form is, you have an exposition where you have the ideas, then you have a development section, and then you have the recapitulation in a strict kind of theoretical way. So when I got back into music, but you get a recapitulation, but in Beethoven, and you notice in a lot of composers, they have a recapitulation that doesn't recapitulate, to quote one of my teachers, Milton Babbitt, that because when the music comes back a second time, you're changed by what happened before. Right. So it's never going to be the same. It's never going to be the same ideas coming back. Well, that's what happened with me. When I got back into music, I was a different person. And so the music was different. And so the music that I wrote in my 20s is a lot different from the music that I'm writing now. And, it's a compulsion that you have to create.
Can you say now, can you be specific about where do you get the inspiration?
Well, that's also interesting, because when I was a student, I felt, at least at one time, there was a popular music side, and there was improvisational jazz maybe, and then there was classical. And you find that with a lot of composers, that when they write popular music, the same composer writes classical music, and the music is really different. It's almost like a lot of people will put a barrier and say, well, that's not the way certain music should sound. And that to some extent happened with me when I was in the academic world. There was a certain style that was more or less acceptable. And then later on, when I got back into music, I basically didn't care about that anymore. And so I merged a lot of styles that were all in my head, but they were sort of in their little silos. And when I started writing again, I merged them all together. And so rather than having something that would be popular or jazz or classical, it's sort of a fusion of different things. And you see that in Bach, for instance. Bach's music isn't entirely German. It's not entirely Italian. It's not entirely French. It's a fusion of all those styles together, and that's what makes his music so compelling and unique. And so I I basically took down all the barriers and just decided this is what I'm going to do. Plus, I'm older, and I don't have to impress anybody anymore. So I'm writing the music that I feel like writing.
Yeah, and you don't have to stick to the discipline of the young man close to the university, be told what to do, and now you can do whatever you think is what you want to be. What made the change? I mean, was it just you were just away from composition for 20 plus years?
I was, and it's kind of a difficult thing because when I was at the university, I didn't quite fit there. I thought maybe. And when I talked about what inspires you, I think a lot of artists have maybe relationships with different styles or different environments that they think at one time is what their career or what their role is going to be, and then later on it proves to be disappointing. And that's what happened with me. I thought at one time the academic world was going to be where I would fit, and maybe I was searching to fit a little bit too much, but I thought, this is the place, this is it. And whenever I arrived at that whatever environment, I thought, this is it, this is finally it. And then after a few years, the relationship soured, the impression soured, and I thought, well, that wasn't really what I wanted. So I got out of music professionally and went into a totally different field, computers and software, and didn't write a note of music for about 25 years. And that's I thought that was where I would be satisfied, because in a sales position, which is where I was most of the time, you get immediate gratification if you make a sale.
Yes.
You show your customer shows the appreciation by paying you.
Yeah.
In the artistic world, it's more elusive. You might think that you write a piece that's fantastic, like it's the greatest thing, and then now you have to convince the artistic world of the merit of your work. And sometimes somebody will like it, another person won't like it. It's not so explicit as in sales. So I felt that at least at that stage of my life where I wanted a little bit of appreciation for what I was doing, that the business world was a little bit more inviting. So I stayed there for a while. Fortunately, I was somewhat good at it. If I weren't, I probably wouldn't have stayed as long. But I felt that at some point my life was missing something. And I didn't know I was going to get back into composition. I thought maybe it was something else. But in the end, I bought a Steinway B, Model B piano, because I wanted a certain sound. And I revisited all my repertoire that I played in college, and everybody they just loved what I was doing. And I thought, this is great. They said, hey, play some Chopin. My wife said, Naomi said, play some Chopin. I thought, this is interesting. People are asking me to play Chopin all the time. I thought, when I was writing music in the academic world, nobody really asked me to play the stuff I was writing. But they're asking me to play Chopin. So there must be something to this music. And obviously I studied it, but I didn't study it from the standpoint of learning how to compose from it or learning something from it that would lead to creativity. It was more of a historical study. So I began to think about that. And finally, after playing a lot of the repertoire and just loving what it was a sound, I put the music down and said, the next piece that I play is going to be something I'm writing myself. And I had no idea what it would sound like. I had no idea. So I started just playing chords on the piano and doing different things. And I really liked it. And then I thought, okay, I better start writing this down. And that eventually became my piano sonata. And I sought the inspiration and the guidance of Beethoven, actually, when I was writing it, because it was turning into something. And I thought, well, let's see how Beethoven did this. And that was another thing that I didn't do as much when I was in college, because I was looking at the classics as more for historical study, but not for inspiration on how to create something new. So I brought out my Beethoven. I have my Beethoven here, my Henley edition.
Oh, yes.
And
all of them.
I opened up the Waldstein Sonata, and I thought, well, let's see how Beethoven handled length, and let's see how he handled structure. And I actually mapped it out. I figured out how long, how many measures, how long each section was. And as I was writing, I was comparing what I was writing with Beethoven, and I looked at it and thought, okay, Beethoven lengthened this a little bit, so let me add some more music here. And so I was doing that throughout the piece, and eventually I finished it. But it was totally different from anything I had written in my 20s, and it was different from anything that I've heard. And I thought, well, if anything, it's unique. If people don't like it, I'll play it myself. It's a unique work. So I revised it a few times, but in the meantime, I rejoined the musical community and got inspiration from what I was hearing. And Weltklassik was one of the things. I don't mean to go over too much on what I was doing, but it was a kind of an interesting experience to get back into music, because I never thought I would do it. I thought, well, I was settled. I had a decent job in the computer and software business, and that tells you about music and art and how compelling it can be and how attractive it is. It becomes a compulsion to get back into it. And it wasn't for the money. Nobody was interested in playing my music even. Yes. I just did it.
Yes. And there is a pattern for me which shows as far as innovation is concerned. After these, I think, 70 interviews I've done so far in the last 2 months. And it seems to be that innovation is a balance between, yes, doing something new, inventing something new, but it's better is based on something which is there. What you described on the Beethoven sonata, on using the Beethoven sonata for your own inspiration, because when you were very young, you said, oh, I'm a composer, I do everything new, completely new, and it just is, there's no link. There's no link. And as soon as there's the link to, if there's something good, something great, like a Beethoven sonata, and then you say, okay, I'm going to develop this further. I think this is the territory where innovation really takes place.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, because you have different strains of thought with art and composition. You have people that basically say that what was the past is the past, and I don't really care to do anything with that. And you see that throughout music. And then you see others that build on historical precedent. And by the way, in my sonata, there's not a note of Beethoven's in it. No. Beethoven's structure is so distinct and so organized and so it's something that you could look at like a building. You can say, there is the foundation. Yeah. There is the plumbing. Mm-hmm. There is the electrical. You could do that with Beethoven and then extract that entire structure and come up with a totally different piece of music. The structure is so strong, so well built. Yes. And so that's what I did. But there's some people that say, I'm going to throw this all out and start over and wipe the whole slate clean. And the problem with being new is that it gets old for a while. You do something for the shock value, and eventually it may not have lasting meaning for an audience once that shock value wears away. Mm-hmm. Well, you have to have some substance.
You need to repeat the surprise with completely different means. I mean, did you have some similar? Yeah, did you have some similar inspirations by Mozart? What did Mozart do for you? If it's the structure with Beethoven, what is it?
I gravitated towards Beethoven mainly because of the way Beethoven developed his music, and Mozart also. I just didn't think as much. Although in my new music, I am concentrating more on melody than I ever did when I was younger. When I was younger, the melody was not as important as the structure and the intellectual satisfaction of creating some kind of a structure or some kind of a concept. But I wasn't concerned as much about the melody. Now I prefer to have something that someone can sing. And that, I think, sets apart my music from a lot of contemporary music, because melody is not as now I'm talking about quote-unquote classical music. You go into film music, and which is where a lot of the musical traditions are still very much alive. Melody is very important in film music, most film music. So it's a very interesting thing. That's what's driving me right now. I'm combining a lot of inspirations from different music, not just classical, quote unquote classical music, but popular music of my childhood, jazz music, and what I come up with is not really anything like any of those influences, but it's a sort of a combination of fusion.
So
of
it's
those
new.
Styles.
It's really new.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. and also the emotional. When I mentioned about Chopin, there's it's an emotional involvement in the music that I didn't really consider when I was a student, and now I do. I want to engage the performer and engage the audience in what I'm writing. So that was something I didn't care about. I didn't really care when I was writing in my 20s about that. So a lot of that has to do with, I think, maybe a selfishness that many people have when they're younger. They just think about themselves. And later on, maybe as you mature, you think about other people and about maybe what the effect of what you're doing is on other people. And the audience is, when you look at a composition, you have different communications that you deal with. The composer communicates with the composition as they're writing it. The composition has a certain structure. The composer is communicating with the performer. The performer has a relationship with the piece. And then the audience has a relationship with the performer. All those relationships have to be all in synchronization to have a successful piece of music, in my opinion, which I didn't think about in my 20s.
Yeah. I didn't think about it either. It came so often during these talks. I think Sofia Gubadamova started when she said, "Oh, I miss the public," and then, we think as organizer, you miss the applause, No. She said it's not the applause; it's the dialogue. She was really talking about a dialogue you have with the audience. You feel the way they're breathing influences the way she plays. It's all very irrational, but you know what I mean. What you say is even more. It's between the composer and the pianist and the audience. There's something irrational, but it's there. Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think it's the best performances are where you have that relationship. And a lot of times, if you listen to a recording of that performance, it might not affect you the same way as the live performance did, because you were in the moment, you were in that experience. Yeah. And I think you see that with a lot. Not all performers have that attitude. There are some performers, they're very detached when they perform. A lot of people used to think, for instance, that Heifetz performed that way. And there's some conductors that are not really engaging with the audience. And then you have others like Leonard Bernstein, who was so involved with the audience that and it made a big difference in his performances.
Yeah. From what you compose, do you focus on piano when you say, no, I'd like to have something sung? What about your wife's harp? Who is presenting on stage? Do you prefer to present your music yourself, or do you like it if young pianists do what you've composed? Give us an outlook.
Well, the piano sonata was unique because I really wrote it before I had any relationship with a musical community. So I figured if no one else played it, I'd play it myself. But nowadays, I have a relationship with a lot of different performers and performing arts organizations. So they commission me, or they have events where they want certain compositions done, certain instrumentation that they suggest, and I write for that. So now I'm pretty much writing music to order. And I have enough of a background in writing for different instruments that it really doesn't matter. If somebody wants to write me to write a piece for any instrumental combination, I do it, and I find inspiration in doing it. When I'm writing a piece, I get into a sort of a groove. At the beginning, I'm organizing ideas, but then when I'm into it, I realize, okay, this is the piece. So if I have to write a string quartet, it's a different state of mind than writing a piece for solo piano or writing a piece for orchestra or something like that. So it doesn't really matter. But now, I think for me, it's harder to write a piece in a vacuum, just to write a piece. For instance, the Art of the Fugue, Bach wrote the Art of the Fugue. There were no instruments that were specified. And so people have been figuring out really how to make it sound good in different instrumental combinations. He wrote it basically as an exercise, as an intellectual exercise. Mm-hmm. But he didn't do that all the time. And I think a lot of composers don't work that way. I don't work that way now. I really have to have a reason to write something. And what I do is I have sketches. So I do sketching, and I do it on either manuscript paper or on the computer. And the sketches have no instruments in mind. They're mm-hmm. just musical ideas. Mm-hmm. So then if somebody says they need a certain complement of instruments, mm-hmm. I'll go to the sketch and say, okay, let me turn that into that. Oh, so it's sort of like an embryo.
Yes.
Not a real, mm-hmm. It's not a real person yet. So mm-hmm. that's how I write. Instead mm-hmm. of writing a piece that has no performance, because I'm so busy right now. I don't really want to write something unless there's a performance that's in mind. So I just mm-hmm. sketch, mm-hmm. and that's how I write.
And when I try to imagine you composing, is it like you are in a room, in a box, and we see the smoke from the brain, and you stay there for 26 hours, and then you come outside and it's ready? Or how does it really work? Give me a picture, please.
In my house, I have an office, and I built the office when I started my computer business, basically to save money on rent of an office space. And I built it to my specifications. So the office is private. And later on, when I started composing again, when I resumed my composing career after a 25-year absence, I used the office for that. So I have an electronic keyboard, a Yamaha electronic keyboard, and I have my computer that I use Sibelius, which is a music publishing program mm-hmm. named after the composer. Mm-hmm. And so once I get started, I rarely go to pencil and paper. Sometimes when I'm outside the room, I have an idea, I put it on pencil and paper, but it's far easier for me to use the computer to expand on something. Because if you want to add a measure, if you're in Sibelius, you want to add a measure, you just add a measure mm-hmm. and everything moves over. If you're in pencil and paper and you have 5 pages of music and you want to add a measure, well, mm-hmm. if you've looked at Chopin's manuscripts and you see all these cross-outs, that's what you had to do. Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. So it's much easier to use the computer. Mm-hmm. The computer is a tool. It's not something that generates. A lot of people have misconception. They think you're using a computer. And in the past, I did use a computer to actually help generate music. But nowadays, I use it as a tool.
And when you started with your sketch, do you stick to the idea and say, oh, God, I need to do this now until it's finished for hours and hours? Or is it possible to say, okay, no, I just do something, I have breakfast, I go for a walk, and then I go back to work, and then I try a couple of chords. How's your working discipline process?
It depends on where I am in the process.
Okay.
If I'm at the beginning, sometimes mm-hmm. I'm a little susceptible to distractions mm-hmm. because I'm not as focused. Mm-hmm. But once I get involved and I see where the piece is heading, and that's another thing I learned from Beethoven. Mm-hmm. And in classical, when I say classical, I mean the classic period, yeah. Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, mm-hmm. is that if you just play a few seconds of a piece of Haydn, you'll probably know where you are in the piece. Mm-hmm. And a lot of contemporary works, maybe that the composer doesn't care that you know where you are. I'm more of a classicist in that I really want to know where the piece is heading. Mm-hmm. And once I know where the piece is heading when I'm writing, then I'm really motivated. Then I don't eat, I don't sleep. I have to be told when it's time to eat. But that's the way I get so focused. But at the beginning, I'm just organizing things, mm-hmm. and then maybe my mind wanders a little bit. Mm-hmm. And sometimes with the sketches, sometimes I use them, sometimes I don't. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I totally discard them. Mm-hmm. But the sketches keep my mind fertile mm-hmm. with ideas and keep my mind focused on something. And then if I don't use them, then at least I had the frame of mind where I was writing something at that time.
Okay. Well, I thank you very much for giving us this intense insight into real creative work. It sounds to me like a lot of discipline mixed with eruptions.
Well, you have to have some feeling there. I mean, if you write music and you have, in my opinion, and you have no emotional bond with the music, then it won't resonate with the audience and the performance.
Yeah. Well, it sounds
that's an element you can't quantify.
Yeah.
What makes music emotional?
Yeah.
That's something that you can't quantify.
Yeah. But what we can see is that it needs, what is absolutely obvious and visible is that it needs passion. And I mean, you talking about this just tells us it's a lot of passion. I hope we have the real chance to have you in Germany one day, and all these crises are over. That would be really lovely.
Interesting. You know, the internet has made it possible to get the music everywhere in the world, and unfortunately, it's more difficult to be physically as opposed to electronically in other areas of the world.
Interesting, it really is. Do you have maybe one final advice for the young pianists? A couple of the troupe of Weltklassik is doing some compositions, and so I was just hoping that maybe you have. From your perspective, what would you tell them if that's one thing?
Well, I think that it's most important for any musician, any artist, to discover what inspires them. Mm-hmm. And also to find their niche. And in business, of course, we always want that. We want to find out what makes a person unique. Why would you buy from one person versus another, especially if you're selling the same product, which is challenging. So if you're an artist, if you're a musician, if you're a pianist, I think if not that I mentioned Chopin and mentioned Beethoven, but if you only play the music that everyone else is playing, then it's much more difficult. It's certainly possible to distinguish yourself, having a unique interpretation of a piece that everyone else is playing. But I think what I found with the Weltklassik performances is that each performer brings music that might not, in addition to the familiar works, brings a work that might not be as familiar. And sometimes it's because they come from a certain country where the music might be more well-known there and not known outside the country. Yeah. Sometimes it's an unfamiliar work by a composer that might be familiar to other people. But if you look at Beethoven's time, it would have been unthinkable to have a concert devoted to music that was 150 years old. It was unthinkable in Beethoven's time. Yes. People wanted the new music all the time. Yes. Nowadays, it's more common. So I think you have to think about what makes yourself unique and bring in because most audiences don't want to be shocked. I mean, some audiences, contemporary music audience may want to be, but most audiences want a little familiar music and maybe a little surprise. Yeah. And so if you build that in, and there are lots of pieces that can fit the mold that an audience will like, even though it's not familiar. And I've heard that on many of your concerts. That would be what I would recommend to a musician. Don't just concentrate on the works that other people are playing. Find some unusual works that also could fit in a great program. My music has been played in performances with Brahms and Beethoven and Mendelssohn. Yeah. And the audience loved my pieces also.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I think it comes back to this innovation, it's a bit bridging the gap between what exists and what we all know, what makes us feel comfortable, and also going a step ahead and trying new territory. Not too much, but a little bit. It's a question of balance. Yeah. Very nice. Thank you very much, Aaron Alter. I'm looking forward to reading you again on Facebook and hopefully to see you live one day here in Germany.
Same here, okay. Catherine. Thank you for the opportunity.
Take good care. This is Aaron Alter, and he's in Carlsbad in California now. And my name is Catherine Harstick, as you might know. And if you'd like to support the pianists who are out of job for the last 3 months now, it would be lovely if you became a producer of these films. And how this works, you can find out if you read the how do you call this? The extra, I think is the word in English. If you read the extra, you can find out on how to support the pianists. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.